The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail when Jake Morrison found her, unconscious, dressed in designer clothes that had no place in Wyoming's rugged terrain. Her delicate hands, scraped and dirty, told a story of desperate flight. He didn't know then that bringing her back to his ranch would change everything. As she recovered, sharing little more than her first name, Grace, Jake glimpsed a woman trapped between two worlds. One of suffocating wealth she was desperately trying to escape, and another of simple freedom she'd never known. But when helicopters started circling his property and black SUVs appeared on the horizon, Jake realized he'd stumbled into something far bigger than a stranded traveler. Could a man who'd spent his life avoiding complications protect someone whose very existence invited chaos? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison's weathered hands trembled slightly as he lifted the brass latches on his grandmother's medical kit. The mahogany box, its corners worn smooth from decades of use, had been a fixture in the ranch house since before he was born. Inside, modern supplies now nestled alongside the original brass. Instruments, a bridge between past and present, much like the ranch itself. He glanced at the unconscious woman on his couch. In the warm lamplight, her features were striking: high cheekbones, elegant nose, and dark hair that, even matted with trail dust, spoke of regular salon visits. Her clothes, though dirty and torn, probably cost more than he made in a month. The broken heel of her designer shoe had been her undoing on the rough track, leading to the nasty sprain he was now tending. "What in heaven's name were you running from?" he murmured, pressing a cold compress to the swelling on her forehead. The question hung in the air, unanswered save for the quiet tick of the grandfather clock and the distant lowing of cattle. Thunder rolled across the valley as Jake worked, the storm that had threatened all afternoon finally breaking. Rain drummed against the tin roof of the ranch house, a familiar lullaby that usually brought him peace. Tonight, it only amplified the strangeness of the situation. Him, a solitary rancher pushing 40, playing nurse to a mysterious woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine and into a thriller. He cleaned the scrapes on her, hands and knees methodically, the skills his grandmother had taught him coming back naturally. Margaret Morrison had been the closest thing to a doctor these parts had seen for 30 years. She'd taught him well how to stitch a cut, set a bone, and most importantly, when to know a situation was beyond his skills. The woman's breathing was steady, her pulse strong. The bump on her head was concerning, but her pupils had been equal and reactive when he'd checked. Still, he kept glancing at his satellite phone, wondering if he should call in help. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away in good weather and with the storm. She stirred, muttering something he couldn't catch. Her fingers clutched at the blanket he'd draped over her, and her face contorted in distress. "Not going back," she mumbled. "Can't make me—" "Father?" Jake frowned, adding another piece to the puzzle he hadn't asked to solve. Someone's daughter, running from something, or someone. His gut, honed by years of reading people and animals alike, told him she wasn't dangerous. Desperate, yes. Afraid, certainly. But not a threat. He rose from his crouch beside the couch, his knees protesting the movement. The medical kit's hinges creaked as he closed it, the sound triggering a flood of memories, his grandmother tending to his scraped knees, bandaging ranch hands' wounds, even delivering the Henderson twins during that blizzard in '95. The old kit had seen its share of stories. Now it was part of another one. The kitchen light flickered as another thunderclap shook the windows. Jake put on a pot of coffee, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. He'd need to check on the herd at first light. Storms like this could spook them into breaking through fences. But he couldn't leave her alone for long. His nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and cell service out here was as reliable as a politician's promise. He settled into his father's old recliner, positioned to keep both the couch and the front door in view. The rifle above the fireplace was within easy reach, a habit born of living alone in ranch country, not distrust of his unexpected guest. Still, as the storm raged outside and the woman's breathing settled into the rhythm of deeper sleep, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stepped into something bigger than a simple rescue. The coffee maker sputtered its completion, and he rose to pour a cup. Steam rose from the black liquid, carrying the rich aroma that had fueled countless early mornings and late nights on the ranch. Through the kitchen window, lightning illuminated the yard in stark flashes, transforming familiar shapes into mysterious silhouettes. His border collie, Scout, lay alert by the couch, dark eyes fixed on their visitor. The dog had shown no aggression when Jake carried her in, a good sign. Scout was a better judge of character than most people Jake knew. Time crept by, marked by the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the gradual easing of the storm. Jake used the quiet hours to tend to small tasks, checking weather reports, on his laptop, reviewing cattle futures prices, responding to emails from his cattle broker. Normal, mundane activities that felt surreal against the backdrop of this extraordinary night. Around midnight, she grew restless again. This time, her eyes fluttered open, revealing a startling shade of green. Fear flickered across her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "You're safe," Jake said softly, staying in his chair to avoid startling her. "Found you passed out on the trail, brought you to my ranch. I'm Jake Morrison." She tried to sit up, then fell back with a wince. "Grace," she whispered, voice hoarse. "I'm Grace." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the rustic furnishings, the medical kit on the coffee table, the rain-streaked windows. Thank you. Easy now," he cautioned as she made another attempt to rise. "You took a nasty fall. Sprained ankle, bump on the head. Nothing broken, but you'll be feeling it tomorrow." Grace's hand went to her head, fingers gently probing. "The swelling there. How long?" "About 4 hours. Storm's keeping us in for now, but I can get you to a doctor in the morning if needed." "No!" The word burst from her with surprising force. "No doctors, please, I'll be fine." Jake nodded slowly, filing away another piece of the mystery. "Your choice. But you're not going anywhere tonight. Try to rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." She sank back into the cushions, tension visible in every line of her body, but exhaustion won out over fear, and within minutes her breathing deepened again. Jake watched as Scout settled closer to the couch, the dog's protective instinct apparently extending to their guest. Outside, the storm began to fade, but Jake knew the real tempest. Whatever had driven this woman to flee across his land in designer heels was yet to come. For now, though, she was safe, and that would have to be enough. Dawn painted the Wyoming sky in watercolor hues when Grace next opened her eyes. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Coffee mingled with something cooking, so different from the sterile air fresheners that pervaded her family's mansion. As awareness returned, so did the pain. Her ankle throbbed, and her head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. She pushed herself up carefully, taking in her surroundings with new clarity. The room spoke of history and honest wear. Hand-sewn. Quilts, well-oiled leather furniture, photographs in simple wooden frames. Through the window, she could see mountains painted with early morning light, their majesty both welcoming and intimidating. This was about as far from her Manhattan penthouse as she could get. The sound of boots on hardwood made her turn. Jake Morrison looked different in the morning light, still rugged, but less imposing than he'd seemed in her feverish memories of the night before. He carried a tray with what smelled like breakfast, his movements suggesting he was trying not to startle her. "Morning," he said, setting the tray on the coffee table. "Figured you might be hungry, nothing fancy, just eggs, bacon, and toast. Coffee's fresh." Grace's stomach rumbled traitorously at the sight of real food. When was the last time she'd eaten? The day before yesterday. Everything since her escape had blurred together. "Thank you," she managed, accepting the mug he offered. The coffee was strong and black, nothing like her usual almond milk latte, but right now it tasted like heaven. "You didn't have to do all this. Ranch rule, we feed our guests." He settled into the recliner, his own mug in hand. "How's the head? Better?" It wasn't entirely a lie. The room had mostly stopped spinning. "I should probably get going with that ankle." "Not likely." His tone was gentle but firm. "Besides, nearest town's 40 miles away, unless you've got someone you want me to call." Grace tried to hide her flinch at the suggestion, but from the way his eyes narrowed slightly, she knew he'd caught it. Her jacket lay folded over the arm of the couch, and she fought the urge to check if the newspaper clipping was still safely hidden in the inner pocket. The last thing she needed was for him to find out who she really was. No one to call, she said, forcing a smile. "I was just traveling through, taking some time to figure things out." "Choster." Jake took a slow sip of coffee, his expression suggesting he found about as much truth in that statement as she'd put into it. "In Christian Louboutin." Grace blinked. "You know designer shoes?" "I know enough to know those red soles cost more than most folks around here make in a month. Also know that nobody goes hiking in them unless they're running from something." She focused on her coffee, using the mug to hide her expression. This cowboy was sharper than she'd expected. "It's complicated." "Usually is." He stood, gathering the empty breakfast plates. "Listen, I'm not asking for your life story, but if you're in some kind of trouble, legal trouble, I need to know. Got a responsibility to my neighbors out here." "It's nothing like that," Grace said quickly. "I haven't done anything wrong. She trailed off, unsure how to explain without explaining. "Had to get away." He finished for her. She nodded, grateful for the simplification. "Well, you've got at least a few days before that ankle's ready for walking. Room upstairs is yours if you want it. Might be good to lay low for a while, let whatever it is settle down." The kindness in his offer brought unexpected tears to her eyes. When was the last time someone had offered her help without wanting something in return? "I can't pay you," she admitted. "I left in a hurry, didn't bring much cash." Jake's laugh was surprisingly warm. "Ma'am, if I wanted to run a hotel, I wouldn't be 40 miles from the nearest Starbucks, but I could use an extra pair of hands around here, even temporarily. You work for your keep. We'll call it square." Grace looked down at her manicured nails. "And designer clothes. I don't know the first thing about ranch work. Everyone starts somewhere." He headed toward the kitchen, then paused. "Oh, and Grace, whatever's in that newspaper clipping you keep checking for in your pocket, it's your business, but if it brings trouble to my door, I expect honesty in return for sanctuary." He left her there, mouth slightly open, wondering how he'd noticed. The tiny movements she'd thought she'd hidden. The border collie, Scout, she remembered Jake calling him, thumped his tail against the floor, as if amused by her surprise. Through the window, she could see Jake walking toward the barn, his stride, steady and purposeful. The morning sun caught on something in the distance, a satellite dish, she realized, so not completely cut off from the world then. She should be worried about that, about the possibility of news reaching here. But somehow, watching Jake disappear into the barn, she couldn't summon the energy for fear. Her fingers brushed the hidden pocket of her jacket, feeling the crisp edge of the newspaper through the fabric. The headline burned in her memory. Maxwell merger secured through strategic alliance. Heiress Grace Maxwell to wed industrial scion James Preston. The photo showed her at the engagement gala, smiling the perfect society smile she'd perfected. Over years, only she knew how close she'd been to screaming. The article didn't mention the real details of the merger, how her father's company was bleeding cash, how Preston Holdings had swooped in with an offer they couldn't refuse, how her marriage to James had been part of the negotiations from the start. Property transfer, that's all it was. One asset changing hands to save the family legacy. She tried to be the dutiful daughter, tried to convince herself that generations of Maxwell women had made similar sacrifices. But when she'd overheard James discussing their prenup with his lawyer, specifically the clause about behavioral modification expectations, something in her had finally snapped. The next morning, she'd walked out of her penthouse with nothing but her purse and the clothes on her back. No credit cards, no phone, nothing that could be traced. She'd made it halfway across the country before her cash ran out, before her ridiculous shoes had betrayed her on a rocky trail, and now here she was, being offered sanctuary by a man who seemed to see right through her careful lies, yet was willing to give her space to keep them. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fled an arranged marriage only to find herself dependent on the kindness of a stranger. Scout padded over and laid his head on her knee, brown eyes full of canine wisdom. Grace scratched behind his ears, earning a contented sigh. "What do you think, boy? Should I stay?" The dog's tail thumped against the floor again. Through the window she could hear the distant sounds of cattle lowing, of life continuing in its simple, honest way. For the first time in days, Grace felt her shoulders relax. Maybe, just for a little while, she could pretend this was where she belonged. Jake stood in the barn doorway, fighting back a smile as he watched Grace examine the leather work gloves he'd just handed her. They were old, but well-maintained, the leather soft from years of use. They'd belonged to his sister before she'd moved to Colorado, and by some stroke of luck, they looked to be about Grace's size. "These are interesting," Grace said diplomatically, turning them over in her hands as if they were ancient artifacts. Given the state of her perfectly manicured nails, they might as well have been. "They're not Gucci, but they'll keep your hands from getting torn up." He gestured to the waiting wheelbarrow and pitchfork. "Ready for your first lesson in mucking." "Out stalls?" The look she gave him was pure Manhattan socialite meets country confusion. Mucking, cleaning out the horse stalls. Hay, manure, old bedding. It all needs to go. He demonstrated with the pitchfork, trying not to notice how her designer, jeans, somehow she'd packed those in her hasty escape, hugged her curves. Simple enough, just take some muscle. Grace squared her shoulders, lifted her chin and pulled on the gloves. The gesture was so unconsciously regal that Jake had to remind himself she was supposedly just another traveler. Everything about her screamed old money, from her perfect posture to the way she managed to look elegant even in work gloves. "I can handle it," she said, taking the pitchfork from him. "I mean, how hard can it be?" 2 hours later she had her answer. Jake found her sitting on an overturned bucket, strands of hair escaping her ponytail, a smudge of dirt across one cheek. She looked exhausted, frustrated, and somehow more real than she had that morning. "I think," she said between breaths, "I may have underestimated the difficulty of manual labor." Jake leaned against the stall door. "You did good. Most city folks would have quit after the first stall." He offered her a bottle of water, which she accepted gratefully. "Your ankle holding up okay?" "Surprisingly, yes." She rotated it experimentally. "The rap you did helped a lot." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft shuffling of horses and the distant bleating of sheep. Grace pulled off the gloves, examining her hands. The manicure was definitely worse for wear, but there were no blisters thanks to the gloves. "These must have belonged to someone special," she said, running her thumb over the subtle tooling on the leather. "They're well loved. My sister's, Sarah. She helped run the ranch until she married a ski instructor in Aspen." He shrugged, but Grace caught the hint of old pain in his voice. "Can't blame her. Ranch life isn't for everyone. Do you ever think about leaving?" The question seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. Jake took his time answering, watching as Scout herded a few chickens across the yard. "This land's been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded here when it was nothing but sage and dreams. Every fence post, every building, every blade of grass has a story." He met her eyes. "It's not just what I do, it's who I am." Something flickered across Grace's face. Recognition, maybe, or envy. "Must be nice," she said softly, "being so sure of your place in the world." Before Jake could respond, A sound cut through the morning quiet, the distant thrum of helicopter blades. Grace stiffened, her face going pale beneath the dirt smudge. Jake noticed her hands trembling slightly as she pulled the gloves back on, clearly seeking something to do. "Probably just the wildlife service," he said, keeping his voice casual. "They do aerial surveys this time of year, right? Of course." But she stayed in the barn until the sound had faded completely. Jake didn't push. Instead, he showed her how to curry the horses, teaching her the rhythmic strokes that would smooth their coats. She was a quick study, and he found himself watching. The gentle way she spoke to the animals, so different from her initial uncertainty with the pitchfork. "You're good with them," he observed as she worked. "Horses can tell when someone's genuine." "They're easier than people," she replied, then added quickly, I imagine they would be. This is my first time really being around them." "Another small lie," Jake noted. Her hands moved with too much confidence for a complete novice. But he let it slide, just as he'd let slide her obvious reaction to the helicopter. Whatever she was running from, she wasn't ready to share it. The rest of the morning passed in a rhythm of simple tasks. Jake taught her how to check water troughs, measure feed, and identify signs that an animal might need attention. She absorbed it all with an intelligence that suggested she was used to learning quickly, though her questions revealed genuine curiosity rather than mere efficiency. Around noon, they sat in the shade of an old oak tree, sharing the sandwiches. Jake had packed. Grace had rolled up her sleeves, and Jake couldn't help noticing a thin white scar on her forearm, the kind that came from expensive crystal shattering against expensive furniture. Another piece of the puzzle he wasn't meant to solve. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for not asking questions. Everybody's got things they'd rather not talk about." He watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. "Out here, we judge folks by what they do, not what they're running from." She was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Scout's head where it rested in her lap. "And what if what I'm running from catches up? Then we'll deal with it." He met her startled look steadily. "Running away from something isn't the same as doing something wrong. Way I figure it, everybody's entitled to remake themselves if they need to." Tears shimmered in her eyes before she blinked them away. She looked down at the work gloves, now properly broken in by her morning's labor. "I think your sister would understand," she said softly, "wanting a different life." Jake watched as she pulled the gloves back on with newfound purpose, her movements more confident than they had been that morning. The helicopter might have rattled her, but it hadn't broken her resolve. There was steel under that society polish. She just needed the chance to find it. "Come on," he said, standing and offering her a hand up. Still got the afternoon fence check to do. Think you can handle it?" Her smile, bright and genuine, caught him off guard. "Lead the way, Mr. Morrison. I'm learning that I can handle quite a bit more than I thought." The Lucky Spur Diner was the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu or decor since 1975, and Jake liked it that way. Every Wednesday, he'd drive into town for supplies and treat himself to Linda's chicken fried steak. It was his one concession to routine in an otherwise unpredictable ranching life. Today, though, the familiar comfort of the diner felt off-kilter. Maybe it was because he'd left Grace alone at the ranch for the first time in a week. She'd insisted. She'd be fine, said she had plenty to do with feeding the animals and collecting eggs. Still, he'd found himself checking his rearview mirror more than usual on the drive in. "Earth to Jake Morrison." Linda's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood by his booth, coffee pot in hand, giving him the same look she'd been giving him since he was a teenager sneaking extra pie. "You planning to stare at that empty cup all day?" "Sorry, Linda, just thinking. About that pretty young thing staying at your place?" Her eyes twinkled as she filled his cup. "Word travels fast, even out here." Jake suppressed a groan. He should have known better than to think Grace's presence would go unnoticed. In ranch country, everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. "She's just helping out for a while," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Temporary arrangement." Linda's knowing smile suggested she didn't believe that for a second. Well, she picked an interesting time to blow into town. You seen the news lately? Jake followed her gesture to the ancient TV mounted in the corner. He usually ignored it. The reception was spotty at best. But today the screen showed a crisp image that had to be coming from the diner's newly installed satellite dish. His coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. The sound was muted, but the caption was clear enough. Maxwell heiress still missing. Family offers reward. The photo showed Grace, a different Grace than the one he knew, dressed in an evening gown, her smile practiced and plastic. The ticker at the bottom mentioned a $250,000 reward for information leading to her safe return. Looks like quite the story, Linda continued, oblivious to Jake's sudden tension. Rich girl runs away from her own engagement party. Some people saying she was kidnapped, others saying she's just having a breakdown. These trust fund types, you never know. Think I'll take my usual to go today, Linda, Jake interrupted, already, pulling out his wallet. Got to check on that new fence line before dark. Linda blinked at his abrupt change of plans, but knew better than to push. Sure thing, honey. I'll wrap it up. Jake forced himself to move naturally, to breathe evenly, to do nothing that would connect his reaction to the news story still playing silently above the counter. But his mind was racing. The Grace on screen matched the woman currently feeding his chickens, but they couldn't be more different. His Grace, he caught himself on that thought, had calluses forming on her hands and laughed with genuine joy when she managed to gather eggs without getting pecked. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake tensed as two men in dark suits entered. They looked as out of place in the Lucky Spur as Grace's designer shoes had looked on his ranch. One of them caught his eye and nodded, a practiced professional gesture that set off every warning bell in Jake's head. Afternoon, the taller one said, approaching the counter where Betty, Linda's daughter, was working the register. We're looking for information about a missing person. He pulled out a photograph. Have you seen this woman? Jake kept his expression, neutral as he paid for his food, but his peripheral vision caught Betty's slight frown as she studied the photo. She'd been at the feed store last Thursday when he'd brought Grace into town for supplies. They'd only been there a few minutes, but in a town this size, that was enough. Can't say that I have, Betty said, and Jake silently thanked whatever. Instinct had made her lie. But we get mostly locals here. You might try the truck stop out on Highway 16. They see more travelers. The man in the suit nodded, but his partner was already scanning the diner. Jake felt the weight of his assessment, knew he was being categorized and dismissed as just another local. Linda returned with his takeout bag. Here you go, Jake. You tell that girl of yours I expect to meet her properly next time. Jake managed to smile, acutely aware of the suit's sudden interest. She's not my girl, Linda. Just passing through. That's not what those fresh-baked cookies you bought at the market say, Linda teased. Nobody stress bakes like that unless they're sweet on someone. Any other time, Jake would have enjoyed the familiar banter. Now, with Grace's face still flickering on the TV screen and two private investigators within earshot, each word felt like another nail in a coffin he wasn't ready to close. He made it to his truck without hurrying, forced himself to start the engine and pull away at a normal speed. In his rearview mirror, he saw one of the suits step outside, phone to his ear. They'd be checking vehicle registrations next, asking about local ranches, following the thread that Betty's lie had inadvertently started. The drive home seemed to take forever. Fields and fences blurred past as his mind churned through implications. Grace wasn't just running from an unwanted marriage. She was at the center of a manhunt that involved serious money and serious people. The kind of people who could make problems disappear, along with troublesome ranchers who got in their way. He should be angry at her deception, should be planning how to get her off his property before she brought trouble down on everything he'd worked to protect. Instead, he found himself remembering the way she'd looked this morning, wearing his sister's old flannel shirt, hair in a messy bun, as she talked softly to his most temperamental mare. the way she'd slowly begun to shed layers of artifice, revealing someone real and vulnerable beneath the society veneer. The ranch came into view, and he saw her in the garden, Scout faithfully at her heel as she gathered vegetables for dinner. She looked up at the sound of his truck, her whole face lighting up with a smile that held nothing of the polished mask he'd seen on TV. Jake killed the engine, making a decision that would either save her or destroy everything he held dear. Either way, they were about to have a conversation that would change everything. He reached for the takeout bag, now cold, and headed toward the woman who'd brought chaos to his carefully ordered world. The TV news story played again in his mind, but this time he focused on a detail he'd caught just before leaving, the date of her disappearance. 3 weeks ago. She'd been running for 3 weeks before she found his ranch. He wondered if she had enough strength left to keep running, and if he had enough courage to give her a reason to stay. The kitchen had always been Jake's favorite room in the house, with its worn wooden counters and the perpetual smell of coffee. Tonight, though, the familiar space felt charged with tension as he watched Grace methodically chop vegetables for dinner. She'd insisted on cooking, claiming it helped her think. He hadn't argued, knowing they both needed time to prepare for the conversation ahead. You saw the news report. It wasn't a question. She hadn't looked up from the cutting board, but her knife strokes had become more deliberate, controlled. Yes, no point in denying it. There were men asking questions at the diner. The knife paused. Private investigators? Looking like they stepped out of a Manhattan law firm? Yeah. He leaned against the counter, giving her space while staying close enough to catch her if she ran. You want to tell me the rest, Grace? Or should I say, Miss Maxwell? She set the knife down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Then, with movements that spoke of years of ingrained propriety, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something that caught the evening light streaming through the window. A diamond ring, massive and ostentatious, yet somehow empty of warmth. $3 million, she said quietly, placing it on the counter between them. That's what it's worth. James had it custom-made by Cartier, said it had to be visible from across a boardroom. Her laugh held no humor. I wore it for exactly 6 hours before I ran. Jake looked at the ring, thinking how it could buy his ranch 3 times over. The merger? You really did see the news. She finally met his eyes. Yes, the merger. Preston Holdings was poised to acquire Maxwell Industries in a hostile takeover. My father was about to lose everything his father and grandfather had built. The marriage was James's idea of a gentleman's agreement. He'd stop the takeover if I agreed to become Mrs. Preston. And your father agreed to this? He didn't have to. I agreed. She turned back to the vegetables, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. I thought I could do it. Be the dutiful daughter, save the family legacy, preserve hundreds of jobs. It's what Maxwell women have always done. Married for advantage, maintained appearances, kept the empire running. Jake watched. As she continued chopping, her movements precise despite her obvious distress. What changed? I overheard James talking to his lawyer about the prenuptial agreement. He had included behavioral modification clauses, penalties if I didn't maintain the right image, didn't produce an heir within 3 years, her voice caught, didn't properly represent the Preston family interests in all matters. The knife came down harder on an unfortunate carrot. That's when I realized I wasn't going to be a wife. I was going to be another acquisition, another asset to be managed and controlled, just like every other merger James had orchestrated. Jake moved slowly, deliberately, and covered her hand, with his stilling the knife. Grace. She looked up, and the raw vulnerability in her eyes made his chest ache. I know I should have told you, but these past days, being here, doing honest work, being treated like a real person instead of a portfolio addition, she drew a shaky breath. I couldn't bear to see that change. You really think that little of me? The hurt in his voice surprised them both. No, I think that much of this, She gestured helplessly at the space between them. Whatever this is becoming. The kitchen fell silent, except for the quiet bubbling of the soup on the stove and Scout's gentle snoring from his bed in the corner. The diamond ring caught the last rays of sunset, throwing rainbow prisms across the worn cabinets. Beautiful, but artificial, like the life Grace had fled. "My grandfather," Jake said finally, "used to say that a person's worth isn't in what they own, but in what they build. He meant it about ranching, but I reckon it applies to life too." He turned Grace gently to face him. "The woman who's been here this past week, the one who gets up before dawn to help with chores, who figured out how to ride a horse in 3 days, who makes my coffee better than I do. That's the real you, isn't it?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't. "Look away. I think maybe it is. I never knew for sure until I came here." Jake reached past her and picked up the ring. It felt cold and heavy in his hand. Nothing like the warm strength he'd come to associate with Grace. With deliberate care, he opened the kitchen drawer where he kept odd bits and pieces, dropped the ring inside, and closed it. "There's a storm coming," he said, nodding toward the darkening sky outside. "Probably hit around midnight. I'll need help checking the horses before it rolls in." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "After that, we can talk about your options, all of them. But right now, I'm more interested in who you are than who you were running from." Grace stared at the closed drawer for a long moment, then back at Jake. Something shifted in her expression. Relief, maybe, or recognition. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unguarded it made his heart twist. "The horses," she said, managing a watery smile. "Right, I should change into work clothes. Might want to grab a jacket too. Air feels like rain." She started to leave, then turned back suddenly. Before Jake could react, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." Then she was gone, her footsteps quick on the stairs, leaving Jake alone in the kitchen with the lingering warmth of her kiss and the knowledge that he was falling for a woman whose very presence put everything he owned at risk. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Scout lifted his head, ears perking at the sound, but settled again when Jake scratched behind his ears. "What do you think, boy?" he murmured. "Are we in trouble here?" The old dog's tail thumped once against the floor, and Jake couldn't help but smile. Maybe his grandfather had been right about another thing too. Sometimes the biggest risks brought the greatest rewards. He heard Grace coming back down, her footsteps already familiar in his home. The ring lay forgotten in the drawer, and with it the weight of expectations that had driven her across the country to his door. Tonight, they would check the horses, watch the storm roll in, and maybe, just maybe, start building something real from the ruins of her carefully planned life. Morning after the storm, Jake found the tire tracks cutting across his lower pasture. Deep fresh treads from heavy vehicles, nothing like the ranch trucks and tractors that usually crossed his land. Scout circled the tracks restlessly, hackles raised, while Jake crouched to examine them more closely. "Town car tires," he muttered, running his fingers along the sharp edge of a tread. 3 vehicles. By the spacing. His eyes followed their path toward the county road, where they disappeared into the general traffic of ranch life. They'd come sometime during the night, using the storm for cover. The sound of hoofbeats made him straighten. Grace approached on his old mare, Copper, her riding already confident after just a week of lessons. She pulled up short when she saw his expression. "Jake? What is it?" "We've had visitors." He gestured to the tracks. "Professional types from the look of it. Same kind of vehicles I saw in town yesterday." Grace's face went pale, but she dismounted smoothly, her movements controlled despite her obvious fear. "They're getting closer." "They're being thorough," Jake corrected, watching as she walked the perimeter of the tracks. "But they haven't found anything yet, or they'd have come straight to the house." The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture, painting everything in stark contrasts of light and dark. Grace stood in one of these shadows, her borrowed ranch clothes and wind-tangled hair making her look nothing like the society heiress from the news. But her bearing, the straight spine, the lifted chin, betrayed her breeding. "I should leave," she said quietly, "before they connect me to you." "And go where?" Jake stepped closer, close enough to see the flutter of pulse in her throat. "They've got resources, Grace. Money. Manpower. You really think you can outrun them? On your own. I can't let you risk everything for me. Your ranch, your reputation, my choice." His voice was firm. "Besides, running now would only confirm their suspicions. We need to think this through." A meadowlark called from a nearby fence post, its morning song incongruously cheerful against their tension. Grace absently stroked Copper's neck, the horse sensing her anxiety and pressing closer. "The Hendersons stopped by while you were checking the north fence," she said finally. "Sarah mentioned seeing unusual vehicles up by Miller's Creek last night. Said they looked like government types." Jake frowned. The Hendersons were his closest neighbors, 10 miles west. If the search had spread that far, they're working a grid pattern. Systematic. These aren't just private investigators anymore. "James," Grace's hand clenched in Copper's mane. "He has connections in federal agencies, probably called in favors, made this into something bigger than a runaway bride." She laughed bitterly. "Can't have a Preston looking foolish after all." "Scout," barked suddenly, drawing their attention to movement on the distant road. A black SUV crawled past, its tinted windows reflecting morning light like a predator's eyes. "Inside," Jake said quietly, taking Copper's reins. "I'll put her away. Stay clear of the windows until we figure out our next move." Grace started toward the house, then turned back. "Jake," her voice was small but determined, "I won't blame you if you want me to leave. This isn't your fight." He secured Copper's reins before answering, choosing his words carefully. "When my father died, this ranch was drowning in debt. Banks were circling like vultures. Know what happened?" He waited for her slight headshake. "Every rancher in the valley showed up. Helped with harvest, fixed fences, even pitched in to pay off some bills. Didn't ask for anything in return, just said, 'This is what we do.'" "That's different," Grace protested. "They were your neighbors, your friends, and you're someone who needs help." He met her eyes steadily. "Out here, that's enough." The SUV made another pass, slower this time. Jake watched Grace hurry inside, then led Copper to the barn, his mind already working through options. The ranch had hidden places, old line shacks, hunting blinds, caves in the high country where his grandfather used to wait out blizzards. Places that wouldn't show up on any satellite map or property record. Inside the barn, he found Grace's riding helmet knocked off its peg, likely by Copper's movement. As he picked it up, a business card fluttered to the ground, crisp white cardstock, with raised black lettering, professional, expensive. "Special Agent Thomas Kane, FBI," he read aloud, turning the card over. On the back, in precise handwriting, "We should talk, Mr. Morrison. This can end badly or well. Your choice." The threat was clear enough, wrapped in federal authority and implied consequences. Jake slipped the card into his pocket. His decision already made. He'd meant what he said about helping those in need, but there was more to it now. In just a week, Grace had become something he wasn't willing to lose. To the FBI, to James Preston, or to her own fears. He found her in the kitchen, phone in hand, staring at a number she hadn't yet dialed. "My father," she explained, without looking up. "I could call him, try to negotiate something. Maybe if I agreed to a smaller wedding, different terms." Jake took the phone gently from her hands. "Is that what you want? To negotiate better terms for your own sale?" "No." The word came out like it had been torn from her. "But I don't want anyone else hurt because of my choices." "Then we'll find another way." He showed her the business card. "They're trying to pressure us into making mistakes, but we've got something they don't." "What's that?" "Time." He pulled out a local map, spreading it across the kitchen table. They think you're desperate, running scared. They'll expect quick movements, obvious choices. So we'll do the opposite. His finger traced a route into the high country. I've got a cabin up here, original homestead site. Not on any modern maps. We can move you there, make it look like you've moved on. Let them chase shadows while we figure out a real solution. Grace studied the map. Her analytical mind, the one that had been trained since childhood to handle business negotiations, obviously working through scenarios. They'll watch the ranch, track your movements. Let them. I've got legitimate business up there, grazing rights, water access. Nothing suspicious about a rancher checking his high country fence lines. He paused, watching her process the plan. But you need to be sure, Grace. Once we do this, there's no middle ground left. No negotiating with Preston or your father. It's all or nothing. She touched the business card, then looked up at him with eyes that held equal parts fear and determination. When I first ran, I was just running away from something. Now, she took his hand, her fingers warm and certain against his. Now, I think I might be running toward something instead. Outside, the black SUV made another pass, but this time they let it go by without flinching. They had work to do, plans to make, and a future to fight for, one that had nothing to do with mergers, marriages, or Manhattan penthouses. Grace sat at Jake's kitchen table, staring at the glossy magazine spread before her. The society page of the New York Times style section stared back, its professionally lit photos and carefully crafted words mocking everything her life had become in the past 2 weeks. Jake stood behind her, one hand resting supportively on her shoulder as they both read the announcement that had set everything in motion. Preston Maxwell Union Herald's New Era in American Business, the headline proclaimed. Below it, a photo showed Grace and James Preston at their engagement gala, champagne glasses raised in practiced poses. She looked like a stranger to herself. Now, perfectly coiffed, expertly made up, wearing a designer gown that cost more than Jake's truck. "You look uncomfortable," Jake observed quietly, his finger tracing the edge of her frozen smile in the photo. "Even then, I was." Grace touched the paper gently, as if it might bite. This was the moment James announced he was adding a family values clause to the merger agreement. Any hint of scandal, any deviation from his idea of a proper corporate wife, and the deal would be void. "He knew my father was in the room, knew the company would collapse without the merger." She swallowed hard. "He knew I couldn't say no." Jake pulled out a chair and sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Tell me everything, Grace. No more half-truths." She nodded, drawing strength from his steady gaze. "Maxwell Industries has been in my family for 4 generations. We started as a small manufacturing company, grew into technology, eventually became a cornerstone of the New York business world. My grandfather expanded too fast, took on too much debt. My father tried to fix it, but the market changed." Jake finished, understanding the universal language of family legacy. "Yes, we were vulnerable. James," she spat the name like it tasted bitter. "James saw an opportunity. Preston Holdings had been trying to acquire our tech division for years. When they discovered how deep our financial troubles went, they struck. The hostile takeover was just a formality. The marriage was the real weapon." Jake studied the article, his eyes catching on specific phrases. "A union of old money and new vision," he read. "The merging of America's business aristocracy." They make it sound like a fairy tale. "More like a horror story." Grace stood abruptly, pacing the worn linoleum. "Do you know what James's last 3 wives did after their divorces? Nothing. They couldn't. The prenups were ironclad, the non-disclosure agreements absolute. They vanished into golden cages maintained by Preston money to keep quiet about." She stopped, wrapping her arms around herself. "About what, Grace?" "The abuse." The word fell like a stone in the quiet kitchen. "Not physical. James is too smart for that. But the control, the manipulation, the slow destruction of everything that makes you a person." She turned to face Jake. her eyes bright with unshed tears. The last Mrs. Preston tried to start a small catering business after the divorce. Suddenly, every supplier in New York blacklisted her. The one before that wanted to write a book. Her manuscript mysteriously disappeared, along with every backup copy. They weren't just divorced, they were erased. Jake rose and crossed to her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. That's why you ran. Not just from the marriage, but from the erasure. I couldn't... Her voice broke. I couldn't let him turn me into another ghost. When I found the behavioral modification clauses in the prenup, I knew he didn't want a wife. He wanted to own me, just like he owns everything else. Scout whined softly from his bed, picking up on her distress. The old dog padded over and pressed against her legs, offering comfort in his simple way. Grace's hand found his head automatically, drawing strength from the warm, solid reality of him. The FBI agent, Jake said slowly. The one who left his card. He's not really FBI, is he? Grace shook her head. James has people everywhere. Private security who carry federal credentials, corporate lawyers with judicial connections. The agent is probably real enough, but he's on Preston's payroll. They all are. And the company? Your father's legacy? Will collapse without the merger. She laughed, a hollow sound. That's the real irony. I ran to save myself, but in doing it, I've probably destroyed everything my family built. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs. The Maxwell name will become a cautionary tale in business schools. She met Jake's eyes. Still want to help me? Now that you know what it could cost? Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking at the society page spread across his kitchen table. The Grace in the photo was a corporate princess, groomed for a life of board meetings and charity galas. The Grace standing before him had calluses on her hands and sun on her face, her hair tangled from morning rides and her borrowed flannel shirt bearing traces of barn dust. You know what I see in this picture? He finally asked, tapping the engagement photo. I see a woman who was willing to sacrifice everything to save her family's legacy. And here, he touched her cheek, rough fingers gentle against her skin. I see that same woman still trying to protect everyone but herself. Jake, you're not destroying your family's legacy, Grace. You're refusing to let it destroy you. There's courage in that. He glanced at the magazine again. Besides, something tells me there's more to this story than a simple merger gone wrong. Companies like Preston Holdings don't need elaborate marriage schemes to acquire failing businesses. Grace stilled. What do you mean? I mean, maybe we should be asking what's in Maxwell Industries that's worth all this trouble. Worth buying FBI agents? Worth setting up this whole elaborate trap? He met her eyes steadily. Worth destroying lives to keep control of. Understanding dawned on her face. The neural interface patents, she whispered. They're still in development, but if they work... God, how did I not see it? That's what James really wants. The rest is just theater. And that, Jake said quietly, is information we can use. Outside, a helicopter thumped in the distance, too far to be an immediate threat, but a reminder that time was running out. Grace looked at the society page one last time, at the stranger she'd been just weeks ago, then deliberately turned it face down. The cabin you mentioned, she said. How soon can we move? Tonight. Jake was already running through mental calculations. I'll need to make some calls, set things up. You'll have to trust me completely. Grace reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. I already do. The helicopter sound faded, but they both knew it would be back. The society page lay forgotten on the table, its fairy tale promises revealed as the prison bars they really were. But as Jake pulled Grace into his arms, holding her close in his sun-warmed kitchen, they both knew there was no going back to that gilded cage. Not now, not ever. The security camera feed on Jake's laptop painted the scene in grainy black and white, but the intent was clear enough. 3 black SUVs approached the ranch's main gate, no longer bothering with subtlety. Grace watched over Jake's shoulder as men in suits emerged from the vehicles, their movements precise and practiced. 8 of them, Jake noted, his voice carefully neutral. "Split into teams. They're doing this by the book." James's book. Grace's fingers dug into the back of Jake's chair. The one where he always wins. The timestamp on the footage showed 3:47 a.m. They'd known this was coming, had prepared for it, but the reality of armed men approaching through the pre-dawn darkness still sent ice through Grace's veins. "Time to move," Jake said quietly, closing the laptop. "You remember the plan?" Grace nodded, already reaching for the pre-packed bag by the door. They'd spent the last 2 days preparing, setting up contingencies, making sure everything looked natural. The laptop would stay, too easy to track. Their phones were already shut off, batteries removed. Nothing electronic would go with them except Jake's old ranch radio, its channels encrypted by a hardware modification his military buddy had installed years ago. Scout's low growl alerted them to headlights sweeping the yard. Jake moved to the window, keeping to the shadows. "They're splitting up, 2 teams to the house, 1 circling behind to the barn." His voice held the calm of a man who'd thought through every angle. "Good. That's what we wanted." Grace checked. Her watch. An old mechanical one Jake had given her, nothing that could be traced. 3:52 a.m. The timing had to be perfect. "You're sure about this?" she whispered, though they'd been over it a dozen times. Jake turned from the window, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. Without a word, he crossed to her and pulled her into a kiss, deep, desperate, and filled with everything they hadn't had time to say. When he pulled back, his voice was rough. "I'm sure about you." A sharp knock at the front door made them both freeze. "Mr. Morrison?" A professional voice, too smooth to be truly rural. "This is Agent Kane. We need to speak with you." Jake squeezed Grace's hand once, then raised his voice. "Kind of early for a social call, isn't it?" He moved toward the door, while Grace slipped. Toward the kitchen's back entrance, exactly as they'd planned. "We have a federal warrant, Mr. Morrison. Please open the door." All right. Let me get some pants on." Jake made a show of bumping into furniture, buying precious seconds as Grace eased the back door open. Scout followed her silently. The old dog, understanding the need for quiet. The security camera feed on Jake's phone, their last piece of technology before going dark, showed the third team approaching the barn. Right on schedule. Grace paused at the corner of the house, breathing in the pre-dawn air. The stars were just beginning to fade, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. This place had become home so quickly, had shown her who she could be when stripped of pretense and privilege. Leaving it felt like leaving part of herself. The sound of the front door opening carried clearly in the still air. "Agent Kane," Jake's voice, perfectly casual. "What brings the FBI to my door at this hour?" "You know why we're here, Mr. Morrison. Where is she?" Grace didn't wait to hear Jake's response. She moved through the shadows toward the barn, Scout a silent shadow beside her. The timing had to be exact. Too early, and they'd be caught. Too late, and Jake would be in danger. The security team approaching the barn was focused on the main doors. They didn't notice the slight figure slipping through the side entrance, didn't hear the soft whisper of boots on straw. Grace reached the prepared stall just as shouts erupted from the house. "Clear!" Male voices, professional and frustrated. "No one in the bedrooms. Check the basement, sir. Tracks leading to the barn." Grace smiled grimly as she swung onto Copper's already saddled back. They'd find the fresh tracks she and Jake had carefully laid an hour ago, would follow them exactly where they wanted them to go. Meanwhile, the real escape route. A hidden door at the back of the stall opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow trail that led into the darkness. Old cattle rustlers' routes, Jake had explained. His great-grandfather had built them into every barn and storage shed on the property. The sound of the barn doors bursting open covered the soft thud of Copper's hooves as Grace urged her through the secret exit. Scout led the way, his white coat ghostly in the pre-dawn light. Behind them, flashlight beams swept the barn's interior. Multiple horses missing. They knew we were coming. Grace pressed herself low against Copper's neck as they emerged onto the hidden trail. The horse, bless her, understood the need for stealth, picking her way carefully through the darkness. They'd practiced this route for 2 days, until both horse and rider could navigate it blindfolded. The security camera feed on the phone showed Jake being handcuffed, his expression appropriately confused and angry as Agent Kane questioned him. He was playing his part perfectly, the stubborn rancher who might have helped a stranger but knew nothing about missing heiresses. Grace turned off the phone and dropped it into a pre-dug hole, exactly as planned. From now on, they were going dark. The next phase would begin when Jake got free, legally with plenty of witnesses to support his story of federal overreach. By then, she'd be established at the cabin, hidden in plain sight among the summer. Grazing herds. The rising sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold as Grace urged Copper up the steep trail. Scout ranged ahead, his breeding asserting itself as he scouted their path. Behind them, sirens wailed as more vehicles approached the ranch, exactly as Jake had predicted. They'd waste hours searching the obvious routes. The places a city woman would logically run, but Grace wasn't that woman anymore. The society princess who'd fled Manhattan would never have attempted this trail in the dark. The Grace who'd learned to trust her horse, to read the land, to believe in herself, that Grace had a fighting chance. Her hand strayed to the small locket hidden beneath her shirt, a gift from Jake, given last night with a quiet intensity that had made her heart race. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper with a series of numbers, coordinates for supply drops, emergency contacts, and most importantly, the date and time when Jake would join her. 2 weeks. She had to survive on her own for 2 weeks while Jake laid the groundwork for their next move. The cabin was stocked, the summer cattle would provide cover for his visits, and most importantly, they had surprised James Preston. For once, the billionaire who bought and sold lives like commodities wasn't controlling the game. The sun finally crested the mountains as Grace reached the first waypoint. She allowed herself one look back at the ranch, now tiny in the distance. Emergency lights flickered around the buildings like angry fireflies. But beyond them, she could see Jake's land stretching toward the horizon, strong, enduring, and free, just like they would be. The map spread across the cabin's rough-hewn table was yellowed with age, its creases worn soft from decades of use. Grace traced the faded lines with reverent fingers, reading the handwritten notes Jake's grandfather had added in the margins. Spring calving grounds, best winter shelter. Watch for washouts after thaw. Generations of ranch knowledge preserved. In careful cursive, 2 days into her mountain exile, and this map had become her lifeline. The cabin itself was sturdy but basic, a single room with a wood stove, narrow bed, and enough preserved food to last a month. But it was the map that gave her purpose, showing her how to navigate the high country that was now her sanctuary. Scout lay by the door, his ears pricking occasionally at sounds only he could hear. The border collie had appointed himself her guardian, showing her game trails and warning her of approaching riders, all of whom, so far, had been ordinary rangers or fellow ranchers, unaware of the drama playing out in their midst. Grace checked. Her watch, the old mechanical one that couldn't be tracked. Time for the evening check of the cattle. She'd never imagined herself as a cowhand, but here she was, responsible for 30 head of Jake's summer herd. Their presence made her hideout legitimate. Every rancher in the area maintained summer. Grazing rights. Come on, boy, she called softly to Scout. The dog rose immediately, tail wagging. She pulled on Jake's sister's old ranch coat, the one that smelled of leather and hay and felt more natural now than any designer jacket she'd ever owned. The evening air hit her face as she stepped outside, crisp with approaching autumn. She'd learned to read the weather up here, where storms could roll in without warning, and temperature drops could be deadly. The sky held high, thin clouds, good weather for at least another day. Copper nickered from her makeshift paddock, and Grace took a moment to check the mare's feed and water. The horse had adapted to mountain life as readily as Grace herself, proving as sure-footed on steep trails as she was gentle with an inexperienced rider. The cattle were scattered across the high meadow, dark shapes against the golden grass. Grace moved among them with growing confidence, checking for signs of illness or injury, just as Jake had taught her. Scout worked the edges of the herd, his herding instincts keeping them from straying too far. "Looking good, ladies," Grace murmured, to the nearest cow, who regarded her with placid disinterest. It still amazed her how quickly she'd learned their individual characteristics, which ones were flighty, which ones were natural leaders, which ones needed extra watching. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she dropped instinctively behind. A large boulder, another skill she'd developed with surprising speed, but it was only a mule deer bouncing away through the sage. Grace smiled at her own paranoia, though she knew it was justified. Yesterday's sweep of rangers had included one man whose boots were too new, whose saddle seat was too stiff. They were still searching, just more subtly now. Back in the cabin, she added the deer sighting to the notebook, where she tracked animal movements. The simple act of recording data, of building knowledge about her environment, helped ground her in this new reality. She was no longer Grace Maxwell, society princess and corporate pawn. Up here, she was just Grace, the rancher's friend, helping with the summer herd. The map drew her attention again as she planned tomorrow's rotation. The cattle needed moving to fresh grazing, and she'd found herself looking forward to the task. Physical work, she'd discovered, had a way of clearing the mind. The complex problems that had seemed overwhelming in Manhattan became simpler up here, stripped down to essentials: food, shelter, safety, purpose. A particular notation on the map caught her eye. Old Miller Place, good spring, better shelter. She hadn't explored that area yet, but Jake had mentioned it was a possible fallback location if the cabin was compromised. She memorized the route, adding it to her growing mental map of the territory. The radio crackled. 7:30 on the mark. Grace held her breath as 3 clicks sounded, followed by 2 long tones. The all-clear signal. Jake was safe, the investigation proceeding exactly as they'd planned. She sent back 2 clicks. Message received, all well here. These brief exchanges were their only communication, but they carried worlds of meaning. In the code they'd developed, varying patterns of clicks could warn of danger, signal a change. Of plans, or simply say, "I miss you." Grace had learned to read them as fluently as she'd once read corporate financial reports. She made dinner from the cabin's stores, simple fare that would have horrified her personal chef in Manhattan, but tasted like heaven after a day's work. Scout got his share, then settled by the stove, while Grace reviewed her notes from the day. The transformation in her own handwriting told its own story. The first entries were shaky, reflecting her fear and uncertainty, but gradually the script had steadied, become more assured. Today's notes were clear and purposeful, detailing weather patterns, cattle movements, and potential shelter sites, with the precision she'd once applied to merger documents. A distant wolf howl made Scout lift his head, but Grace wasn't afraid. She'd learned the rhythms of the mountain, the difference between true threats and natural sounds. The wolf was far away, probably calling to its pack. She understood that now, the need for connection, for family, even in the wildest places. The locket Jake had given her lay warm against her skin, and she opened it to study the tiny numbers inside. 10 more days until he could join her. 10 days to master these hills, to become the kind of woman who could not only survive here but thrive. She turned back to the map, adding her own notation in pencil: "Deer Trail, good emergency route." Her handwriting looked natural next to Jake's grandfather's, as if the land itself had gradually transformed her elegant Manhattan script into something more organic, more real. A log shifted in the stove, sending sparks up the chimney. Grace watched them dance against the darkening sky through the cabin's small window. Somewhere out there, James Preston was pulling strings, calling in favors, trying to force her back into his version of reality. But up here, with Scout's head, on her knee and honest work in her muscles, that reality seemed as insubstantial as the sparks disappearing into the night. She was building something new, something true. And when Jake arrived, they would face whatever came next together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals who had chosen each other freely. The map whispered possibilities as the wind picked up outside. Grace added another log to the stove and settled in to plan tomorrow's route. She had cattle to tend, skills to master, and a future to build. The woman who had fled Manhattan in designer heels was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone real, someone free. The sheriff's truck kicked up dust as it wound its way up the mountain trail, visible long before it reached the cabin. Grace watched its approach through Jake's old binoculars, her heart hammering despite the calm she'd cultivated over the past 2 weeks. Sheriff Wilson was a friend of Jake's, had been best man at his sister's wedding, but his arrival could only mean one thing. They'd been found. Scout pressed against her legs, sensing her tension. The letter in her pocket seemed to burn through the fabric of her jeans, delivered by the sheriff himself an hour ago. Her father's distinctive letterhead and precise handwriting unmistakable even at a glance. The second vehicle following the sheriff's truck was a Mercedes SUV, sleek and black and utterly out of place on the rugged mountain track. Grace didn't need the binoculars to know who was inside. After all, Richard Maxwell III never let others handle family crises. "Well, Scout," she murmured, lowering the binoculars, "guess it's time to face the music." The dog whined softly and she scratched his ears. "Don't worry, I'm not the same. In person they're expecting to find." She straightened her shoulders and walked out to meet them, deliberately keeping to the center of the clearing where the approaching vehicles would have to stop. The morning sun caught on her worn jeans, work boots, and flannel shirt, a visual statement of exactly who she'd chosen to become. The sheriff's truck stopped first, angled slightly to give her cover if she needed it. The Mercedes pulled up beside it, and Grace's breath caught as her father stepped out. He looked older than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his normally perfect posture showing the weight of recent weeks. "Grace!" His voice carried clearly across the clearing, complex with emotion. "Thank God you're safe." "Hello, Father." She was proud of how steady her voice remained. "I assume you got past Jake's lawyers?" "Jake Morrison is currently explaining his role in harboring a fugitive," a new voice cut in, and Grace's blood ran cold as James Preston emerged from the Mercedes. "Though we're prepared to be lenient if this situation resolves appropriately." Grace's hand slipped into her pocket, touching the letter she hadn't yet opened. "Sheriff Wilson," she called, ignoring James completely. "I trust you've seen the satellite photos, the ones showing I came here of my own free will?" The sheriff nodded, keeping one hand casually near his weapon. "Got 'em right here, Miss Maxwell, along with statements from 3 different ranchers who've seen you working the herd, all consistent with Mr. Morrison's account of offering shelter to a woman seeking refuge." His eyes flicked to James. "No laws broken, far as I can tell. The laws regarding corporate espionage are quite clear," James said smoothly. "The intellectual property Ms. Maxwell had access to is still exactly where it's supposed to be," Grace cut in. "In the company's servers I haven't accessed since I left. The neural interface patents are safe, James. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not the merger, not the marriage, just the technology you thought you could control through me." Her father's sharp intake of breath told her the hit had landed. "Grace, what are you talking about? Why don't you ask your future son-in-law about Preston Holdings' recent acquisitions, about the pattern of tech companies they've bought through surprisingly similar marriages, about what happened to those companies' female CEOs after the divorces?" James's practiced smile never wavered, but his eyes went hard. "I'd be careful with unfounded accusations, Grace. They could be damaging to many people's reputations." Grace pulled the unopened letter from her pocket. You mean like the accusations in here, the ones I'm sure paint me as unstable, irrational, possibly dangerous to the company's interests? She met her father's increasingly troubled gaze. Did you even read what he had you sign, Dad? Or did you just trust that James would handle everything? Richard, James started, but Grace's father held up a hand. Let her speak. Grace took a deep breath, drawing strength from the mountain air that had become more natural to her than Manhattan's pollution. The neural interface technology isn't just valuable, Dad. It's revolutionary. Direct brain-computer interfaces that could help paralyze people walk, blind people see, but in the wrong hands. She looked pointedly at James. In hands that care more about control than healing. That's enough. James's voice cracked like a whip. Richard, she's clearly been affected by her time in isolation. The stress of her responsibilities. My responsibilities? Grace laughed, and the sound held all the freedom she'd found in these mountains. You mean the ones you defined in that prenup? The behavioral modification clauses that would let you control everything from my public appearances to my private medical decisions. Show him, James. Show my father exactly what you had planned for his only daughter. The clearing went silent, except for the wind in the pines and Scout's low growl. Grace watched the play of emotions across her father's face, confusion, dawning, understanding, and finally a cold fury she'd never seen before. Is this true? He asked James quietly. The other acquisitions, the patents, the prenup terms? Richard, be reasonable. Business requires certain assurances. The only assurance I need, Richard Maxwell said, his voice arctic, is that you will be on the next flight back to New York, alone. He turned to Grace, and his expression softened. Unless my daughter would like to come home and help me find a better way to save our company. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Dad, not to Manhattan, he added quickly. We can run things from anywhere these days. Maybe somewhere with more fresh air and fewer corporate raiders. James took a step forward. The merger agreement is void, Richard cut in, along with any other documents I may have signed without proper review. I'm sure the SEC would be very interested in the pattern of acquisitions my daughter mentioned. He smiled thinly. I may be old-fashioned, James, but I still have friends in interesting places. You're bluffing. Your company won't survive without selling my daughter's soul. Richard's voice cracked slightly. Watch me find a way. He turned to Grace again. That is, if you're willing to help. Not as an obligation, but as a partner. Grace looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw past the corporate titan to the man who'd taught her to ride her first bike, who'd kept every crayon drawing she'd ever made, who'd somehow lost his way in trying to preserve a legacy that had become a cage for them both. Partner, she said firmly. Equal voting shares, independent board seats, and a complete restructuring of the executive team. Her smile turned wry. I've learned a few things about running complex operations up here. James started to speak again, but Sheriff Wilson's hand on his shoulder stopped him. Think it's time for you to leave, sir. These folks have business to discuss. Grace watched James stride angrily back to his Mercedes, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The letter in her pocket, unread and unnecessary now, fluttered to the ground as she walked toward her father. I have so much to tell you, she said softly, about this place, about Jake, about who I've become. Richard Maxwell looked around at the mountains, the grazing cattle, the simple cabin that had given his daughter back her soul. I think, he said carefully, I'd like to hear everything. The contract lay open on the cabin's wooden table, its legal language stark against the rustic setting. Jake stood behind Grace's chair, one hand resting supportively on her shoulder, as she and her father reviewed the document that would determine the fate of Maxwell Industries' 5,000 employees. The restructuring terms are aggressive, Richard Maxwell said, tapping the relevant clause, converting to a benefit corporation, establishing an employee ownership program, redirecting the neural interface research to a non-profit medical foundation. He looked up at his daughter. "The board won't like it. The board won't have a choice," Grace replied, her voice firm but gentle. "Not with controlling shares split between us and the employee trust." She reached for a pencil, not a Mont Blanc, but a carpenter's pencil Jake used for marking fence posts. "Look at Section 7. The Ethical Oversight Committee will have veto power over any application of the technology." Jake squeezed her shoulder gently, recognizing the steel in her tone. 2 weeks of mountain solitude had stripped away her corporate polish, revealing something far more valuable, a leader who understood both power and responsibility. "It's not just about protecting the patents anymore," Grace continued. "It's about protecting the people who depend on us. Not through control, like James wanted, but through genuine partnership." Richard studied his daughter across the table, noting how naturally she sat in this simple cabin, how confidence had replaced compliance in her bearing. "The transition will be complicated. We'll face resistance, possibly legal challenges. We'll face them together." Grace touched the contract's final page, where 2 signature lines waited, as equals. The morning sun slanted through the cabin's window, catching on the document's official seals and watermarks. Such formal trappings seemed almost absurd. Here, where life was measured in sunrises and seasons rather than fiscal quarters. "Tell me again about your idea for the regional offices," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "The decentralized model." Grace's eyes lit up. "Technology lets us work from anywhere now. Why keep everyone cramped in Manhattan when we could spread out, connect with communities that need investment?" She gestured to the view outside. "Imagine research facilities in places like this, where people can think clearly, innovate freely. Small towns getting high-tech jobs, urban employees having the option to relocate without losing opportunities. The cost of restructuring will be offset by reduced overhead and increased productivity." Grace pulled out a notebook filled with calculations and observations. "I've had a lot of time to think up here, Dad, to strip everything down to essentials and rebuild it stronger." Jake moved to stoke the wood stove, giving father and daughter space to work through this crucial moment. But he couldn't help smiling at Grace's transformation. The woman who'd arrived in designer heels, running from a gilded cage, had found her true strength in these mountains. "The neural interface technology," Richard said slowly, "it could really help people. Life-changing applications." Grace's voice softened. "Spinal cord injuries, neurological conditions, trauma recovery, but only if it's developed ethically, without profit as the primary driver." She met her father's eyes. "That's what Mom would have wanted." The mention of his late wife made Richard's breath catch. "She always said business should serve life, not the other way around." He touched the contract again. "James would have turned it into a control mechanism, used it to create dependency instead of independence," Grace finished quietly. "To own people instead of empowering them." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the cattle grazing peacefully in the morning light. "I learned something up here, Dad. True power isn't about control. It's about cultivation, about helping things grow strong on their own." Jake watched Richard take in his daughter's words, seeing the same quiet revelation he'd witnessed in Grace weeks ago. The Maxwell legacy didn't have to be about empire building. It could be about something far more valuable. "There will be sharks," Richard warned. "Other companies like Preston Holdings looking to take advantage of the restructuring. Let them come." Grace's smile held all the wildness and wisdom of the mountains. "I'm not afraid anymore. And I'm not alone." She looked at Jake as she said it, and the warmth in her eyes made his heart swell. They'd faced down federal agents, corporate schemes, and family expectations together. Whatever came next would just be another challenge to meet side by side. Richard followed his daughter's gaze, seeing the unspoken connection between her and the rancher. "The New York Society pages will have a field day," he said, but his tone was amused rather than concerned. "Maxwell Harris finds love in Wild West. Let them talk." Grace returned to the table, picking up a pen. "I'd rather be a headline for following my heart than for following someone else's script." She held the pen out to her father. "Partners?" Richard Maxwell looked at the contract one last time, not at the legal language, but at what it represented. A chance to rebuild, not just a company, but a relationship, to transform a legacy of control into one of genuine value. "Partners," he said firmly, taking the pen. The signatures were quick, simple strokes. No elaborate ceremony, no board members or witnesses beyond Jake and Scout. Just a father and daughter choosing to trust each other, to build something new from the ashes of what had almost been lost. Grace sat back, tension finally easing from her shoulders. "First order of business, setting up the regional headquarters. You're thinking somewhere in Wyoming?" Richard's eyes twinkled. "The Morrison Ranch has some promising development sites." She reached for Jake's hand. "Assuming my partner's amenable. Do a little diversification." Jake laced his fingers through hers. "Cattle and computers could be interesting." Richard watched them, seeing echoes of his own love story. His late wife had also chosen an unexpected path, had helped him become more than just another corporate raider. "You know," he said carefully, "your mother would be proud of you, Grace. Not for saving the company, but for saving yourself." Grace's free hand went to the locket she still wore, the one containing coordinates and promises and possibilities. "I had help," she said softly, "from both of you." Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and freedom. The contract on the table was more than a business document. It was a declaration of independence, a bridge between worlds, a promise to honor both legacy and growth. Scout padded over to rest his head on Grace's knee, and she scratched his ears absently. The gesture was automatic now, as natural as breathing. Just like the strength she'd found in these mountains, the love she'd discovered in an unexpected refuge, and the wisdom to know that true wealth had nothing to do with stock prices or society. Pages. It had everything to do with being free to choose your own path and brave enough to walk it with an open heart. The evening gown hung on the back of the cabin door, like a ghost from another life. Midnight blue silk charmeuse flowed into a tastefully dramatic train, the kind of Valentino creation that had once felt like armor. Now, after weeks of denim and flannel, it seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. "You don't have to do this," Jake said from his position by the wood stove. He'd been watching Grace stare at the dress for the past 10 minutes, noting the tension in her shoulders. "Yes, I do." She touched the silk briefly, then turned to face him. "The board meeting is tomorrow. We need to present a united front. Show them that the Maxwell family is strong and stable." Her smile turned wry, "even if that means playing dress-up one last time." The transformation from rancher back to heiress took less time than she'd expected. Her hands remembered the motions of elaborate hairstyling, the application of perfect makeup. But the woman who emerged in the cabin's small mirror was neither the society princess she'd been, nor the cowhand she'd become. She was something new, something stronger. Jake's reflection appeared behind her, and the contrast between his worn leather jacket and her elegant gown should have been jarring. Instead, it felt right, like two parts of herself finally in harmony. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, "but not like you're wearing a costume anymore." Grace understood what he meant. The dress was just cloth now, not a symbol of constraint. She wore it instead of letting it wear her. "Ready to face the lion's den with me, Mr. Morrison." His smile held equal parts love and determination. "All the way." The drive to New York took them through progressively more populated areas, each mile bringing them closer to the world Grace had fled. But the panic she'd expected never came. Instead, she found herself viewing familiar landmarks through new eyes, seeing opportunities where she'd once seen only obligations. They arrived at the Maxwell Industries headquarters building just as evening settled over Manhattan. Grace's father met them in the private underground garage, his expression a mix of relief and pride. "The board's already gathering upstairs," he said, hugging Grace carefully to avoid wrinkling her gown. "James has been making calls, trying to rally opposition to the restructuring plan." "Let him try." Grace's voice held the same quiet confidence she'd developed directing cattle through mountain passes. "We have something he doesn't understand." "And what's that?" Richard asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. "Truth," Jake answered simply, his hand warm against Grace's back. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending through her past. Each floor represented a layer of the life she'd lived before. The charity galas, the society functions, the carefully orchestrated appearances, but none of it could touch her now. The boardroom doors opened onto a scene straight from her old life. 20 board members in perfect business attire sat around the massive mahogany table, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. James Preston occupied a chair near the head of the table, his smile as practiced as ever. "Grace," he said smoothly, standing, "how wonderful to see you looking so recovered." She felt Jake tense beside her, but kept her own expression serene. "James, I trust you've had time to review the restructuring proposal." "Indeed. Though I must say it seems rather radical, almost as if it were written by someone not quite thinking clearly." Old Grace might have flinched at the implied threat. New Grace merely smiled, an expression learned from mountain sunrises and honest. "Work? Funny. I've never thought more clearly in my life." She moved to the head of the table, the silk of her gown whispering against the carpet. "Shall we begin?" The next hour was a masterclass in corporate evolution. Grace presented the restructuring plan with the same quiet authority she'd developed handling nervous horses. Each point was laid out with careful precision. The employee ownership program, the ethical oversight committees, the decentralization strategy. "This is madness," one board member finally burst out. "You're talking about dismantling decades of corporate structure." "No," Grace corrected gently. "I'm talking about growing something stronger." She nodded to her father, who distributed a new set of documents. "These are the preliminary agreements from 3 major medical research institutes, all interested in ethical development of the neural interface technology. No private ownership, no profit-driven applications, just pure humanitarian innovation." James's smile finally slipped. "The shareholders will never approve. They already have." Richard Maxwell's voice carried the weight of certainty. "The employee ownership trust combined with our family shares constitutes a controlling interest. It's done, James. You can't possibly expect to run a major corporation from a ranch in Wyoming," another board member protested. Grace laughed softly. "Welcome to the digital age. Our new regional offices will be more connected and innovative than this tower ever was." She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes. "We're not destroying Maxwell Industries. We're setting it free to become what it always should have been, a force for genuine progress." The discussion continued, but the outcome was never really in doubt. One by one, the board members began to see the vision Grace and her father had crafted, a company built on innovation rather than control, on growth rather than acquisition. James was the last to leave, his practiced smile now brittle around the edges. "You've changed," he said quietly as he passed Grace. "Yes," she agreed simply. "Thank you for helping me see that I needed to." After the boardroom emptied, Grace stood at the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The city lights sparkled like stars, but they couldn't compare to the real ones she'd grown used to seeing from the cabin. Jake's arms slipped around her waist, and she leaned back against him. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Home, not the penthouse." Apartment 20 floors up, but a ranch in Wyoming where work was honest and love was real. She turned in his arms, the silk of her gown sliding against his leather jacket. "Almost," she said. "Just one more thing." She reached up and removed the diamond earrings she'd put on for the meeting, her last piece of Manhattan armor. They sparkled in her palm like tears or promises. "For the Employee Education Fund," she said, placing them on the boardroom table. "Let them do some real good for a change." Jake's kiss tasted of freedom and future and mountain air. "Let's go. Home." Grace took his hand, leaving the boardroom without a backward glance. The evening gown still whispered against the carpet, but it was just fabric now. No longer a costume, no longer a cage. Just a dress that had witnessed the final transformation of a woman who had found her true self on a distant ranch, under stars that outshone all the lights of Manhattan. The business proposal looked out of place on the ranch house's kitchen table, its professional binding and glossy photos a stark contrast to the morning's coffee mugs and worn placemats. But the man presenting it seemed perfectly at ease, despite trading his usual ranch wear for a casual business suit. "Regional innovation centers," Jake explained, pointing to the architectural renderings. "Built to blend with the landscape, powered by renewable energy, connected to local communities." His finger traced the proposed locations. "Not just here in Wyoming, but in Montana, Idaho, Colorado, anywhere with the right combination of natural beauty and technological infrastructure." Grace leaned forward, studying the images. The proposed centers looked nothing like Manhattan's glass towers. Instead, they seemed to grow from the land itself, low-profile buildings with living roofs, glass walls that reflected the mountains, courtyards designed for both work and contemplation. "You've been planning this for a while," she said, noting the detailed financial projections and environmental impact studies. Jake's smile held a hint of sheepishness. "That engineering degree I mentioned, it wasn't just about ranch equipment. I've been developing sustainable architecture concepts for years, waiting for the right opportunity." Richard Maxwell picked up the proposal, his experienced eyes scanning the numbers. "The construction costs are significant, but the long-term savings in overhead—" He looked up at Jake with new respect. "You're not just a rancher who happens to know business. You're a businessman who chose to be a rancher." "I chose what felt real," Jake said simply, just like Grace did. Grace touched the proposal's cover, where the proposed company name caught the morning light: Maxwell Morrison Innovation Network. Her throat tightened at the simple hyphen joining their names, representing so much more than a business partnership. "The neural interface research would be perfect for this model," she said, turning to the technical specifications. "Small teams in inspiring locations, connected virtually, but with the space to think deeply. And look at the community integration. Plans, local hiring, educational partnerships, environmental stewardship." Richard nodded slowly. James never understood this aspect of innovation. He thought control bred creativity. "Control breeds fear," Jake corrected quietly, "and fear kills innovation faster than anything else." The proposal's final section outlined the governance structure, a combination of local oversight boards and centralized ethical guidelines. Grace recognized elements of ranch management in the approach, the same balance of individual responsibility and collective wisdom that made agricultural communities work. "The board will fight some of this," she admitted. "They're still adjusting to the restructuring, and this is another major change." "Let them fight!" Jake's voice held the calm certainty of someone used to waiting out storms. "We're not asking permission. We're showing them the future." A knock at the door interrupted them. Scout's alert bark was followed by the sound of boots on the porch, and Sheriff Wilson stepped into the kitchen, looking apologetic. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, holding up a manila envelope. "But you need to see this. Just got it from the FBI, the real FBI, not Preston's people." Grace opened the envelope, her eyes widening as she scanned the documents inside. Financial records, shell companies, James has been busy. She passed the papers to her father. Look at the pattern of acquisitions. Every company that developed promising neural interface technology in the past 5 years. Richard's expression darkened as he read. Buy and bury, he muttered. Classic Preston strategy. Purchase the innovation, then lock it away to protect. Existing market positions. He looked up at Grace. He wasn't just after Maxwell Industries. He was eliminating potential competition for his own neural interface patents. Patents that are nowhere near as advanced as ours, Grace finished. But that wouldn't matter if he controlled both. She turned to Sheriff Wilson. How did you get these? The sheriff's smile was grimly satisfied. Let's just say some real federal agents got interested in Mr. Preston's creative accounting and his unusual relationship with certain supposedly independent regulatory bodies. Jake studied the documents over Grace's shoulder, his rancher's practicality cutting to the heart of the matter. This changes the timeline. Once Preston knows, we have this information. He'll move quickly, Richard agreed. Try to force a crisis before we can establish the new structure. Grace reached for the proposal, her mind already racing ahead. Then we move faster. Dad, how quickly can you convene an emergency board meeting? 24 hours using the crisis provisions in the corporate charter. Do it. She turned to Jake. How soon can you have the first Innovation Center site ready to show? His slow smile told her he was ahead of her. The old Anderson property we looked at last week, I had the preliminary surveys done the next day. We can have a demonstration facility up in 2 weeks. Grace felt the familiar thrill of a plan coming. Together, the same satisfaction she'd found in successfully moving cattle through difficult terrain or navigating mountain trails in the dark. 2 weeks is perfect. Long enough to seem credible, short enough to stay ahead of whatever James has planned. She spread the proposal out on the table, quickly annotating sections with a rancher's pencil. The simple tool felt more natural now than the expensive fountain pens of her past life. We'll need to modify these sections, she said, marking pages. Add safeguards against the kind of manipulation James used. Show exactly how our distributed model protects against corporate raiders. She looked up at her father. Can you get the employee trust representatives on board? Richard was already on his phone. They'll support anything that protects jobs and promotes ethical innovation, especially with these documents showing what the alternative could have been. Jake moved to the window, looking out at the ranch that would soon become the cornerstone of something larger. But his expression held no regret, only quiet certainty. You know, he said softly, my grandfather used to say that good land makes good decisions easy. You just have to listen to what it needs, not what you want from it. Grace joined him, slipping her hand into his. Beyond the window, the mountains rose against the morning sky, solid and eternal and true, like the love that had grown between them, like the future they were building together. The land taught me to be real, she said. Now it's teaching us to build something real. She turned back to the proposal, to the name that joined their worlds. Maxwell Morrison Innovation Network, a place where technology serves life, not the other way around. Sheriff Wilson cleared his throat. I better get these documents to the federal task force. But Grace... He waited until she met his eyes. What you and Jake are building here, it's exactly what these mountains need. What all of us need. After he left, the kitchen settled into purposeful quiet. Richard made calls to board members while Jake and Grace refined the proposal, their different expertise blending seamlessly. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the kitchen in honest light that revealed every detail, every possibility, every promise of the future they were choosing. Together, the USB drive felt impossibly small in Grace's hand, considering the weight of what it contained. She stood in the Maxwell Industries boardroom, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan's skylines in shades of gold and shadow. In less than an hour, this room would become a battlefield, and this tiny device would be her sword. All the files are indexed and authenticated. Jake said quietly from behind her. Even in his perfectly tailored suit, he carried himself with a rancher's steady presence. The FBI's forensic team verified everything twice. Grace nodded, slipping the drive into her pocket. And James doesn't know we have it. Not yet. Though he probably suspects something's coming. A man like that doesn't get where he is without developing a sense for danger. The boardroom door opened, admitting Richard Maxwell. He looked tired but determined, the past week of intense preparation evident in the shadows under his eyes. "The board members are arriving," he reported, "including 3 we hadn't expected, corporate lawyers from Preston Holdings." "Oh, good." Grace's smile held steel beneath its surface. "Let him bring his whole army. It'll make the victory more complete." She moved to the head of the table, arranging the presentation materials with precise care. The USB drive rode in her pocket like a talisman, but it wasn't her only weapon. The past week had seen an intricate dance of preparation. Evidence gathered, alliances secured, trap laid. Board members filed in gradually, their usual morning chatter subdued by the tension in the air. Grace noted their expressions, reading the room like she'd learned to read weather patterns in the mountains. Some seemed nervous, others curious, a few openly hostile. James Preston arrived last, flanked by his lawyers, his practiced smile firmly. "In place, Grace," he said smoothly. "Such a dramatic summons. I trust this emergency meeting has proper justification?" "Oh, I think you'll find it justified," she nodded to her father, who began distributing folders to each board member. "Let's begin with the Preston Holdings acquisition history, shall we?" James's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. "Ancient history. We're here to discuss Maxwell Industries' current, irregular management decisions." Grace inserted the USB drive into the boardroom's presentation system. "Actually, we're here to discuss pattern recognition. Specifically, the pattern of how Preston Holdings handles acquisitions in the neural interface technology sector." The screen came to life, displaying a complex web of shell companies, hidden transactions, and buried patents. Each connection was highlighted in damning red, each financial trail documented with forensic precision. "Over the past 5 years," Grace continued, her voice carrying the same quiet authority she'd developed directing ranch hands through complex tasks, "Preston Holdings has acquired 7 companies developing neural interface technology. Each acquisition followed the same pattern: hostile takeover threat, followed by a marriage arrangement, followed by the systematic suppression of the acquired technology." One of James's lawyers started to speak, but James silenced him with a sharp gesture. His eyes were fixed on the screen, calculating losses and options with almost visible intensity. "The purpose," Grace went on, advancing to the next slide, "was to protect Preston Holdings' own neural interface patents that, as these technical analyses show, are fundamentally flawed, unusable for actual medical applications, unlike Maxwell Industries' breakthrough technology." "This is absurd," James finally broke in. "These allegations are fully documented and verified by federal investigators." Grace removed a second set of folders from her briefcase. "Who are, at this moment, executing search warrants at Preston Holdings offices in 3 cities. Would you like to see the warrant for this office, James? I have a copy right here." The boardroom erupted in confused murmurs. Grace let the chaos build for a moment before continuing, her voice cutting through the noise with ranch-learned clarity. "But this meeting isn't about Preston Holdings' legal troubles. It's about Maxwell Industries' future." She nodded to Jake, who activated the second part of their presentation. "I give you the Maxwell Morrison Innovation Network." The screens filled with images of the demonstration facility they'd built in Wyoming, a stunning blend of sustainable architecture and cutting-edge technology set against the backdrop of mountain majesty. "This is the future of corporate innovation," Grace declared, decentralized, sustainable, community integrated, where breakthrough technologies like our neural interface systems can be developed ethically, with proper oversight and clear humanitarian goals. The cost, one board member started, but Richard Maxwell smoothly interjected, is already covered by the efficiency savings from our restructuring, the federal research grants we've secured, and the preliminary contracts with 3 major medical research institutes. He smiled. Sometimes doing good is also good business. James pushed back from the table, his composure finally cracking. This is a trick, a manipulation to distract from your daughter's emotional instability. My daughter, Richard cut in, his voice arctic, has shown more stability and vision in the past month than you have in your entire career, James. She saw through your attempts to steal our technology, united our employees behind a better vision, and created a future that serves life instead of controlling it. He stood, every inch the corporate titan. The only instability here is your grip on reality. Grace felt Jake's hand brush hers beneath the table, a small gesture carrying mountains of support. She stepped forward, facing James directly. You wanted to own me, she said quietly, to control Maxwell Industries through me, like you did with all the others. But you forgot something crucial. Her smile held all the wildness and wisdom of the mountains that had freed her. I'm not just a Maxwell anymore. I'm also a Morrison. And we don't break, we build. The boardroom doors opened, admitting federal agents with search warrants. James's lawyers huddled together, their whispered conversations carrying hints of panic. But Grace's attention was on the board members, watching